I'm glad to be here. I feel like my message is probably not going to have much of a hard audience in this setting, except for maybe the population. But we'll see how it goes. The paper is largely a brief summary of this book, but I've added some value in it because I've gone back and pulled out some stuff from Yoder, Hauerwas, and things just to make it interesting. And fused another paper in I wrote that was on a similar theme. So even if you've read the book, you might hear a few things you haven't heard of. Socrates famously said that philosophy, or the love of wisdom, begins in a feeling of wonder. And Aristotle fittingly added that wisdom consists in the knowledge of causes, not simply the knowledge that things happen, but also why they do. Over the centuries, while Christians have had a common text or set of precepts, when it comes to the ethics of Jesus, they have not agreed on what it means, its significance. The problem we all face is not that we have different precepts, but that we lack wisdom. We lack the knowledge not of what he said, but the deeper or higher principles that caused him to give these commands and that provide the implicit context that determines their meaning. Or at least we lack consensus on what those higher principles are. So it'd be brash of me to claim that to have the wisdom where so many other wiser interpreters disagree. Nevertheless, I think it is worth offering a solution where none is yet to win consensus, especially when I add that my solution is not very new. My suggestion is this, that Jesus' aim was and is to bring creation to the end for which God always intended it, and his ethical teachings are consistent with this aim. The arguments I present in my book attempted to provide a historical case that Jesus' precepts about violence fit within this general aim, and that they're interpreted incorrectly when they're pushed in a pacifistic direction. So what I want to do today is provide a brief sketch of the book, and then, as I said, interpolate some comments from some famous neo-Anabaptists. I'm also not going to talk about one section of the book which was on the early church. So if you've read that, I'm not going to talk about that at all, though if you want to talk about it in Q&A, we can do that. So, to begin with, I want to turn to the second term in the discussion, the word pacifism. Dr. Nation mentioned Yoder talks about 23 different varieties in his book, nevertheless. I'm not going to talk about that many. Instead, I'm going to talk about two major varieties that I've encountered. One that appeals to natural law as a basis for pacifism, and another kind that appeals to divine positive law. And I'm taking those categories from Thomas Aquinas and philosophers like that who distinguish types of law. I've encountered 6, I'd say, recurring arguments for absolute nonviolence, so the natural law type of arguments, and they are these. The cycle of violence, which you probably all heard. The idea that violence always provokes further violence, and so it never really solves anything. The second argument is about the limits of human knowledge, which says that human beings can never truly determine the guilt of another person, and so coercive judgment can never be verified as just. Another one is about the immorality of punishment in general, so you'll often hear the argument that retribution or vengeance are intrinsically barbaric, they're morally backwards. Then there's the unloving character of violence, so simply put, that violence is not consistent with love. The utopian character of violence, so some people will argue the use of violence implies a utopian aim on the part of the person who uses it. And of course, utopian schemes are always wrong by definition, right? So that's an argument given. And then lastly, the idea that hierarchy itself is intrinsically unjust. So it's sort of an anarchistic argument for pacifism, seeing violence as an imposition of rule of one person over another. So if you think all rule is wrong, then by extension you'll think that enforced rule is wrong. So one characteristic of each of these arguments is that they appeal to aspects of reality that remain true across redemptive history. So parts of the human being as such, or their human nature. And therefore, they imply that nonviolence has always been ethically obligatory for everyone. Then there's another kind of rationale for pacifism that's one based on divine positive law. So here the reason for prohibiting violence does not derive from the nature of human beings, nor from the current state of the created order, including the presence of evil, but rather this prohibition derives directly from an additional divine command given in history. With this kind of rationale, pacifism does not need to be ethically mandatory for everyone always. It's whoever God gave the command to. What all these arguments have in common is a specific conclusion. That is, they entail at minimum that no Christian can participate in state use of violence, especially in the form of killing another person. Then the moral or natural approaches entail a stronger conclusion that no one can ever do that, Christian or otherwise. So I've got these 6 rationales plus the divine positive one. It's worth noting here it's not always easy, at least for me, to pin down where authors like John Howard Yoder, Stanley Hauerwas, or Richard Hayes fall in terms of their positions here. It's even possible that they're not completely consistent. So for example, Richard Hayes in the Moral Vision of the New Testament, he says this: if the Sermon on the Mount was addressed to a marginal community outside the circle of power, its teachings cannot be directly applied in a context where Christians hold positions of power and influence, or where they constitute the majority in a democratic political order. So this would seem to suggest he does not regard the nonviolent teachings of the Christian community as intrinsically already binding on every human being as such. Yet he can also say something like this: on the other hand, an equally serious case can be made that on balance, history teaches that violence simply begets violence. So that's the argument I brought up before. That would be a kind of natural law argument against violence. Similarly, Hauerwas will also make arguments that veer more into my divine positive law category. So in The Peaceable Kingdom, he says, that is why Christian ethics is not first of all an ethics of principles, laws, or values, but an ethic that demands we attend to the life of a particular individual, Jesus of Nazareth. It is only from him that we can learn perfection, which is at the very least nothing less than forgiving our enemies. Yet, as with Hayes, he'll also sometimes make comments that seem to make a natural law argument. So this is from the same book. Jesus thus decisively rejects Israel's temptation to an idolatry that necessarily results in violence between peoples and nations. For our violence is correlative to the falseness of the objects we worship, and the more false they are, the greater our stake in maintaining loyalty to them and protecting them through coercion. Only the one true God can take the risk of ruling by relying entirely on the power of humility and love. So Hauerwas here draws a close connection between violence and idolatry, and it's difficult for me to see on these grounds how coercion could ever be justified for anyone, anywhere. And then finally we have Yoder. He seems to fit into both categories on occasion. For example, in his book, Nevertheless, which we mentioned a few times, he states quite clearly that his variety of pacifism is based uniquely on the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and not on other principles. Yet, while he argues that the idea of nature as a source of ethical norms is the result of an intellectual failure, he says that in his Christian Witness to the State, he nevertheless provides arguments at times that suggest violence is always wrong for everyone. So again, in that same book, in any state we can see self-glorification and the combining of religious and political motivations. The wielding of the sword is always an expression of a degree of unbelief, and the church that blesses this undertaking is always marked by a measure of apostasy. And in the book Nevertheless, he writes, the invocation of violence to support any cause is also implicitly a messianism. Any national sense of mission claims implicitly to be a saving community. One cannot avoid either messianism or the claim to chosen peoplehood by setting Jesus or his methods aside. One only casts the aura of election around lesser causes. So again, that would seem to apply to everyone all the time. So all I have to say, I'm not sure where these names fit. Perhaps someone who studied more of their corpus in greater detail would be able to tell you, but from what I have read, I don't always know the answer. That is all about pacifism and neo-Anabaptists. Now I'm going to get into Jesus, the other term in the book. So I start in the book with the background of what Jesus said, because I think we should interpret people in their context. And I said there was 4 backgrounds that I wanted to bring out. Natural law, the background of literary practices that provide the context for the writings about Jesus, the social setting, the audience that Jesus was talking to, and then the Old Testament. So, natural law. Elsewhere, I've argued that Jesus appealed to natural law as authoritative in his own teaching. That argument will eventually appear in a forthcoming book that Brad and I are eventually going to make sure it's published. Brad's not writing it, but I will. And maybe one other person if we can get into. In the meantime, I'll assume as a starting point, though, that Jesus appealed to assume the existence and normativity of natural law. In light of this, it's fair to ask, what does this law teach about matters of violence and war? This is going to be very brief, but I'll try my best to be clear. First, Aristotle argued rightly, I think, that nature directs human beings towards forming both family and political community. His argument was essentially that human beings cannot survive as isolated individuals, and that they flourish when they live in community. Second, throughout history, most natural law thinkers have recognized that the natural order directs animals towards self-preservation and self-defense. It is important to note here that defense is not necessarily an amoral concept, nor is it necessarily a physically passive. Rather, defense is aimed at the preservation of natural goods, and so it shares in that natural goodness. And this brings us directly to the issue of punishment, because here too we find that basically all of the cultures of the world have recognized that punishment is a just and necessary form of behavior in appropriate circumstances. It consists of giving to people what they deserve, which is the definition of justice in general, when they deserve injury because they have injured others. Third, following from these general principles, the classical tradition rightly derived fairly obvious consequences distilled into the just war tradition. For the sake of brevity, I'll only mention some of these. So, from the fact that the common good represents the highest temporal end of human activity, it follows that whatever acts individual and communities perform must be in accord with the common good. But from this follows the axiom that no one should act when the foreseeable effects of an act will cause more harm than good. So this is a principle in medical ethics. Above all, do no harm, right? And this is the just war criterion of a reasonable prospect of success also. Further, the obligation to act for the good of others entails that no one should harm another person unless they deserve it. So we should be good to people, therefore we shouldn't harm them unless they deserve it, in which case such actions would take the form of punishment if you deserve it, and they'd be an expression of justice. In general, people should do good to their fellow human beings. This intuition is summarized in the criterion of the just cause. And finally, the political nature of the human entails that people should act in community, and insofar as a government represents a community, members should act in accord with their own government. And this entails the third relevant jus ad bellum criteria: wars should be waged by legitimate authorities, by governments and those they have deputized, not by private actors. The natural created order then provides reason for there to be governments that use coercion and for subjects to remain subject to them, including not taking coercion into their own hands. In other words, natural law, I would argue, does not support pacifism. So this provides one context for Jesus' words, what he spoke into when he did speak. A second context comes in the literary customs that are deployed in the writing and interpretation of law. So writers on rhetoric, known in the first century like Greek and Roman writers, made explicit a commonly accepted point. Laws need to be qualified, that there are always exceptions to general rules. This was also apparently true outside of legal context in the less exacting genre of wisdom sayings like the Book of Proverbs. People have noticed forever that there are proverbs that seem to contradict each other, and they see, oh, well, these weren't meant to apply absolutely, they're meant to apply as general principles. And in fact, this is a general convention of human communication. As people, we do not always explicitly state things that we regard as assumed. It would become impossible to communicate if we always had to say everything that we assumed before we said everything. So those three settings: natural law, literary practices, and the third one is social setting. A third context here is the listeners, essentially. Who's hearing Jesus and who is he assuming was listening to him? Richard Hayes notes in his book that the examples in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount fit cases of powerless people. So he assumed an audience of people who didn't have power. They were not actors of the state. Just keep that in mind as we go through. And then the last context is the Old Testament. So as a Jew in particular, Jesus had this inheritance of divine revelation given to him that was a commonplace with all the people he spoke to, and was an authority for him as well, as we'll see. We've already discussed how natural law rules out any type of moral or trans-historical pacifism, and now we can turn to the Old Testament and what it says about pacifism. So it seems to me the Old Testament assumes the existence and knowability of natural law, so it will assume the consequences of that too, but I'm not going to prove that in detail. But it also rules out pacifism more directly. So the cycle of violence arguments contend that violence never solves anything. On the other hand, the Old Testament states the death penalty for idolatry will actually deter people from continuing to practice it. It affirms the efficacy of the state coercion to control the behavior of subjects. The limitation of knowledge approach contradicts the Old Testament's affirmation that people can determine the facts of the matter regarding infractions of the law, so it gives them these laws to administer. Ubiquitous laws punishing crimes obviously oppose the attitude that punishment and retaliation are intrinsically immoral or barbarous. So those are three of the arguments that the Old Testament can't be consistent with. The Old Testament also directs people to treat their enemies lovingly. So John Day, in an interesting book he wrote on imprecatory songs, notes that in texts like Exodus 23:4-5 and Proverbs 25:22-22, and in the story about David and Saul, this command is exemplified, the command to love enemies. So he adds, while it may be granted that the command to love your enemies is nowhere to be found in the Old Testament, The concept cannot be confined to the words themselves, cannot be confined to the words themselves. When enemies are fed and cared for rather than killed or mistreated, love for enemy is being practiced. There is no contradiction between the general virtue of seeking the good of the other, love, even for the enemy, along with such unqualified commands to love. There's no contradiction between that and magistrates using violence for justice in some specifically defined situations. So there's an assumption here that these commands are compatible. The objection that violence is utopian or messianic fails by Old Testament standards because it imputes an intention to the law that the law rejects. It doesn't use violence out of a sense of utopianism, assuming the law could create a state of an Edenic paradise. It recognizes that the root cause of crime is the fallen heart of man, and that only the grace of God can solve this problem. So I have verses in here if you're curious where I'm getting this from, but I'm not going to say them all. The law also approves hierarchy in commanding the Israelites to set up judges to render decisions, and assumes a family structure of elder rule. It also commands subjects to submit to their rulers, though not unconditionally. And then Charles Carlston, in an article about proverbs and maxims in the Bible, he notes the example of taking up the sword. The warning against doing that is perennial and proverbial. It gives the example of Proverbs 22:8, and then other cases in Sirach, and also in Homer and other Greek texts. So it's a proverbial statement. Finally, the Old Testament clearly does not require pacifism along divine positive lines. So there's commands to perform holy war in the Old Testament. Clearly, God wasn't pacifist in that situation. So the whole Old Testament stands opposed to any natural law type of argument for pacifism, and it doesn't support the divine law, positive law version either. Now, that's all Old Testament and background behind Jesus. I'm moving to foreground after Jesus spoke. The documents of the New Testament provide the earliest interpretations of his words. So surveying the corpus of the New Testament, one finds the writers continue to assume all four of those backgrounds as true. The New Testament assumes the existence of and explicitly appeals to natural law in several places. St. Paul does this. They continue to assume the general rules can be stated with unmentioned exceptions, so that's a literary context. Various texts confirm the bulk of the audience consisted of powerless people, and the writers in the New Testament affirm the authority of the Old Testament scriptures. They assume that whatever the Old Testament narrates about God and his actions in history are true. So when we look closely at the discontinuities and rules between the Old and the New Testament, because there are some, it becomes apparent the kinds of laws that no longer bind God's people are symbolic in nature. So the Sabbath law, kosher laws, circumcision, priesthood, and temple rules, and the obligation to perform animal sacrifices. None of these are things you would just deduce from natural law, although I know some people have made the case for the Sabbath, so you can leave that to the side if you want. But the rest of them are obviously additions onto nature. And in place of these, New Testament gives at least two symbolic commands. It gives baptism and Holy Communion. But the vast majority of New Testament commands are not of this kind. They're rather expressions of natural law, summed up in directives to do good, to love, and to act wisely. And this has direct relevance for the issue of pacifism, for as we noted above, the overlap between natural law and the Old Testament on morality of pacifism is complete. They have a complete agreement, as far as I can see. So given all these aspects of the New Testament, we can deduce that it must be opposed to natural law pacifism, at least. This is further confirmed in its positive teachings. So I can't go into all of them. I went into some of them in the New Testament. I'm just going to use one example, which is Paul's direction to excommunicate. His command appears in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and other cases. The reason I don't think pacifism can be consistent with that is because he regards it as a form of punishment. He calls it that explicitly in 2 Corinthians. And I think from that principle you can deduce a lot of things about what justice is, even in the Christian context. However, I'm going to leave that aside. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you want in more detail. So besides that natural law type of pacifism, I also don't see a New Testament text that calls for pacifism on what I call divine positive law grounds. So like a symbolic or an additional requirement beyond natural law. I don't see a text that does that. Usually the texts that are appealed to are stuff like love your enemy, not a ceremonial kind of thing. So that's the background and the foreground. Now we get to the main event, the meat in the sandwich, Jesus. The strongest and most common argument for pacifism, I think, certainly comes from Jesus' teaching in the few places in the Gospels. They seem to be these: the temptation narrative, the Sermon on the Mount and the parallel texts like the Sermon on the Plain, his teaching about taking up the cross, his teaching about Caesar, his teaching about Gentile rulers, his teaching about taking up the sword, and then another argument comes from his own crucifixion. So I can't talk about all those, I just picked a few of them, and you'll see kind of what I have to say there. So refusing Satan's temptation, this is one thing that John Howard Yoder at least appeals to, I think Hauerwas does too, as an example of Jesus rejecting violence in toto. In Matthew's account, the final temptation given to Jesus is world domination. The pacifistic argument from this account usually follows the logic that this temptation represents the zealot option. So Jesus has these options of how he's going to be Messiah, and Satan's offering him, you could be a zealot. And he rejects this. As Hayes puts it, in the temptation narrative, Jesus renounces the option of wielding power over the kingdoms of the world, choosing instead to worship and serve God alone. However, I think there are several reasons to reject this interpretation. Firstly, it wrongly conflates zealot ideology, which is really a holy war option, with a just war approach. Just war thinking follows certain criteria that holy wars do not. So even if Jesus is rejecting a holy war option, it doesn't mean necessarily he's rejecting a just war kind of option. Second, it overlooks the relevance of the background to these temptations, in my mind. Jesus here is recapitulating Israel's wilderness wanderings, where Israel caved into the temptation to worship literal idols. And like Israel, Jesus is also facing the Edenic temptation first offered by Satan, to distrust God and to strive for our own desires in disobedience to God's commands. Jesus' refusal to worship Satan rejects that temptation to use evil means to achieve good ends. His reply is therefore not, you shall not kill, but you shall not worship the Lord your God, and you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. So that's the first kind of argument that's used for Jesus. The second one comes from the Sermon on the Mount itself. And here I'm going to follow briefly the lead of Dale Allison, who's a commentator on Matthew and on the Sermon on the Mount. He notes there are three common errors when exegeting the sermon. The first one is to interpret the text apart from the rest of the gospel. The second one is to read the sermon as a radical departure from Judaism, which is contrary to evidence we have in Judaic texts. And the third is to miss that Jesus' form of teaching is not a prosaic law code, but it's an image-filled poetic text that seeks to cast a moral vision. So keeping these principles in mind, we'll turn to some of the specific parts of the sermon. The first one would be the Beatitudes, where Jesus calls, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. But this Beatitude doesn't say anything that's not expressed or implied in several Old Testament texts. And we know the Old Testament is not pacifistic when we read those texts. So, but we know they can be interpreted in other ways. The statement's not meaningless. First, the virtue of seeking for peace is eminently useful and good in personal relations. And second, even in the matter of statecraft, the just war tradition has always emphasized that war should be the last reasonable resort taken. So peaceful options should be sought first. Second, when Jesus begins the antithesis section of his sermon, before that he talks about his relation to the law and the prophets. That's in verses 5, 17 to 20. And then at the end of the sermon, he mentions the law and prophets again. So his whole sermon is bracketed by these two statements, which essentially indicate his continuity with the Old Testament. So the various components of this three-verse bit deserve particular attention. R.T. France explains the meaning of the words, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." So that key verb kataluo, he says, with reference to an authoritative text, means to declare that it is no longer valid, to repeal, or to annul it. So the issue is not that Jesus' personal practice as such, but his attitude to the authority of the law and the prophets. Jesus then directly denies he has come to annul the authority of the Holy Scriptures. That's what he's saying in that verse. The connecting gar, the Greek word at the beginning of verse 18, for not an iota will pass from the law until all is accomplished, provides Jesus' reason for his denial. So as Craig Keener has noted, his teaching here echoes rabbinic Jewish statements about the letters of the law that affirm absolute and unchangeable authority in the Scriptures. Keener also writes on verse 19 that the Judaism of Jesus' day would have easily understood and agreed about his point about annulling trivial commandments. He says, the point is not that to deny that one was responsible to do whatever God commanded, no matter how trivial it may seem, was to deny his lordship and to intentionally rebel against his whole law. So it's not about just breaking a law. This statement is about rejecting the authority of the law in principle. And he's saying, for Jews and for Jesus, that implicitly rejects the whole authority of God. It's not acceptable, obviously. Thus, verses 18 and 19 work like this, the whole logic of the text. Because the scriptures are the word of God, they cannot be contradicted by the course of history. And because of that same divine authority, no one can rightly alter the law in their exposition of its demands. This is what he says at the beginning of his Sermon on the Mount. Of course, a cursory glance at the rest of the New Testament shows there are some Old Testament laws that are no longer binding. We've already talked about them. However, as we noted, they're all symbolic. There's something added on to the creation. And none of those laws, the ones that are later abolished, we could say, or obsoleted, are present in the Sermon on the Mount. He's not talking about those ones when he gives his sermon about the Christian life. And this, I think, is in accord with the eschatological vision of the Old Testament. From my point of view, the eschaton envisioned in the law and the prophets saw a world restored according to God's original intention, but also a world where the divisions between the families of human beings are no longer in place, not even the ones that God put in the case of Moses in the Torah. So Jesus is essentially saying the Old Testament all along pointed to this era of history when these particular barriers that God set up will no longer be there. But those aren't the things that Jesus is emphasizing the continuity about in this sermon. So, regarding verse 20, contrary to some interpreters like Yoder, who've attempted to argue that Pharisees were examples of perfect obedience to the law, so Yoder takes that view of what Jesus is saying. Jesus, I think, is quite clear of his view of Pharisaical righteousness. So later in Matthew he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." So Jesus' demand in 5:20 then is not about surpassing the demands of the law, taking the Pharisees as a stand-in for the law, but it's about truly obeying the law in contrast to the Pharisees who merely pretend to do it while being truly lawless. So I think the consequence of this analysis must be to incline us to look for continuity between the Old Testament and the sermon when Jesus is talking. Now, I'll take a step out of my book argument for a second. This point about continuity, I think, is a crucial issue between the Neo-Anabaptists and the magisterial position. So in contrast to my perspective, here's Richard Hayes, again, from the Moral Vision of the New Testament. The New Testament's witness is finally normative. If irreconcilable tensions exist between the moral vision of the New Testament and that of particular Old Testament texts, the New Testament vision trumps the Old Testament. Jesus' explicit teaching and example of nonviolence reshapes our understanding of God and of the covenant community in such a way that killing enemies is no longer a justifiable option. So that strikes me as not at all consistent with Jesus' own words in the sermon. And I don't make that point just to talk about theological differences, but about exegetical, historical differences. What does Jesus mean? If we interpret him to mean something that implies what Hayes just said, I think we've misinterpreted what Jesus said, essentially. So continuing, probably the most directly relevant commands from Jesus are about retaliation and love of enemies, the end of the antitheses in that part of the sermon. We've already argued, I said earlier, that not taking vengeance and instead doing good to one's enemies was commanded in the Old Testament, and that the rest of the New Testament, and that in the Old Testament specifically, it's quite clear that such unqualified commands were consistent with participation in ethical state violence. However, some positive interpretation of this text is needed, and while it may seem banal, we should take care to note that all of Jesus' examples of obeying this command are drawn from the normal life of an average politically powerless Israelite. I think this should incline us to affirm the old Augustinian interpretation of these texts, that they are not about the exceptional situations that a magistrate would encounter, but quotidian life, essentially. Now, I've argued that the Old Testament commands love of enemy, but this is not true of all Jewish tradition, where one can find explicit commands not to do good to evil people. We can therefore see that it's these Jewish traditions and not the Old Testament scriptures which Jesus is correcting here by reiterating Old Testament ethics. Next, Jesus gives a command in several places to take up your cross and follow him. Yoder argued that this command was essentially a command to be a faithful minority community under persecution. So that's what the command is about, being a faithful minority under persecution in a community. However, as some have noted in response to Yoder's work, at times he can seem to reduce the meaning of the gospel to politics. And I think this is a case where that is true. What does Jesus mean by the command? Carrying the cross is set in opposition to some other possible choices in Jesus' own words. Among them, instead of carrying the cross, one can love one's family, one can keep all of one's possessions, one can gain the whole world, one can save one's life, and one cannot deny himself. It is easy to see that these last options, like denying oneself, saving one's life, are the essential opposites of carrying the cross. Carrying the cross means being willing to die. Refusal to carry it is rooted in not being so willing. Refusing the cross is thus essentially repeating the sin of the garden. It's an action rooted in distrust of God's goodness, leading to an attempt to maximize our pleasure by breaking God's commands. And to be willing to die is to be willing to give up everything in the world, because then you lose access to the world. In sum, this command requires nothing more of us, in fact, than the greatest commandment does, which was, of course, Jesus' summary of the whole Old Testament. To be commanded to serve God with everything one has means being willing to obey him even to the point of death, if the only alternative to death is disobedience. And the New Testament confirms this in its theology of suffering, especially in places like 2 Corinthians and Romans 8, but I can't get into that either. So the next command or statement actually that Jesus gives that seems relevant to pacifism is about the Gentile rulers and their authority and how they exercise it. So in the book I tried to do a basic lexical investigation, and I found that all of these words can be used in a pejorative way. So it's not simply they're exercising authority, but it's can be something more like tyrannizing or lording it over somebody. So we have that lexical point about what's possible, what those words can mean, and on the other side we see in the New Testament and in Jesus' own words an affirmation of some authority in some context. He appoints the apostles to guide the church in its earliest days. He talks about how in the kingdom of God they will sit on thrones. He also taught the disciples had the authority to excommunicate church members, which at minimum means that the community has the authority to exclude recalcitrant members, even if the exclusion is contrary to the will of that individual. So I see that as an exercise of authority. In fact, nowhere in the Old Testament or in the New Testament is authority per se criticized as immoral, nowhere I can see. Jesus therefore says nothing more than what the Old Testament has already taught, which is that it is commonplace for authorities to abuse their power. This does not mean he believed this was an absolute and fixed law of behavior for magistrates. In fact, the Old Testament contains several stories where the acts of Gentile kings do receive approval. And then the last argument from Jesus for pacifism, perhaps the most dramatic, symbolic one, is his act of submission to crucifixion. So for example, in the Politics of Jesus, Yoder writes, "There is but one realm in which the conception of imitation holds. But there it holds in every strand of the New Testament literature, and all the more strikingly by virtue of the absence of parallels in other realms. This one point we're required to imitate Jesus. This is at the point of the concrete social meaning of the cross in its relation to enmity and power. Servanthood replaces dominion, forgiveness absorbs hostility. Thus, and only thus, are we bound by the New Testament to be like Jesus." So the basic claim is that his refusal to defend himself, Jesus, was an expression of his condemnation of violence in general. He regarded dying as preferable to killing in all situations, and this is now normative for his followers. But I think there are problems with this argument. Granted that Jesus willingly suffered death, a number of possible explanations could provide his rationale for this. One such motive would be to provide the propitiation for the sins of mankind. Now, I know that itself is controversial these days, but I still think it can be defended. And if it's true, then that can be a motive for Jesus. The requirements of just war can provide another. Given that Jesus' historical situation was one where he knew God was not going to save him from the Romans, and where his human followers had no political power, Jesus actually had no prospect of success, and he wasn't officially a magistrate, though he was, in God's eyes, the King of Kings. Further, he had no political authority, as I said. So that's the end of my discussion of Jesus in particular. The texts discussed above, upon close analysis, I think, provide no positive support for any of these arguments. Some of Jesus' teachings, in fact, contradicted these ideas. We noted in connection with the practice of excommunication that practice doesn't fit with a natural law argument against pacifism, and Jesus requires his disciple to perform these actions on some occasion. We know he upholds the authority of the Old Testament, which also contradicts natural law pacifism. And regardless of the positive case against natural law pacifism from Jesus, I think there's no evidence in favor of it. And that would just leave a case for pacifism from divine positive law, which again, I don't see where that comes from. The texts that are appealed to are not usually seen that way. So in conclusion, I just want to give a bit of a bigger picture about where this fits in. While the foregoing argument has not attempted to provide, attempted to provide better parts of the pacifist narrative, better parts, it may seem rather piecemeal, so I've just given you a series of texts, interpreted them differently, but no sense of the whole might appear. So I want to talk about that. And I think that whole is something Brad mentioned, which is the two kingdoms vision of magisterial Protestantism. The two kingdoms vision begins with the distinction between the internal and the external, the soul and the body. God rules the internal immediately and irresistibly in the hearts of believers by the power of the Word through the Spirit. The external kingdom, or regiment, you could say, he rules through various human agents in a way that can be resisted. At the same time, the inward power of the gospel does have external effects. It transforms it organically from the heart outward. The entire purpose of the gospel is to effect this transformation. The Spirit's work aims at restoration and perfection according to creation's original aim. So the external kingdom, ruled by humans according to law, has an intrinsic nature too, one that has traditionally been summed up into the three estates: family, church, and state. So Genesis can be seen to give us the origins of these things. God created humanity and directed them to be fruitful and multiply and take dominion, which originates the family, marriage, and the realm of work. In the likeness, as the likenesses of God, these human beings also had the task and joy of worshiping God. This is a description of the church. And finally, the human family, eventually to be composed of many smaller families, would naturally have to organize themselves together. And this is the task of politics, ordering the polis toward the common good. So those three estates are what nature looks like. And it is nature or creation that the gospel, the good news, through the internal kingdom, the inside work that God does, will one day restore by grace. God works through the inside to restore the outside. Until that day, however, sin remains, and so external law is needed. God hasn't perfected everything at once. Grace, though in many cases eliminating the need for force, does not entirely do so in this world, nor does it require force to be abandoned in the face of severe threats to the political order. Until the day when all things are renewed, the external realm must be regulated by the systems and order of the old age, the age with sin, and so with need of coercion to maintain a minimum of justice. That's what I'll answer now. Thanks.
You guys probably know me by now.
Yeah.
So there's a passage in C.S. Lewis, I can't remember which book it's in, I think it's Mere Christianity, where he speaks about how it's possible to love your enemies and also go to war against them.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment, you mentioned that briefly, could you comment a little bit more about how that works? What does it look like to obey Christ's command to love your enemies, but at the same time be willing to use violence in the defense of a just cause?
Yeah. So this is complicated. I think just war Christians have given different answers to that question. And some of them who attempted to argue that you can imagine killing someone and loving them. And I think that might be true in a qualified sense, but I want to start by saying I don't think that's Jesus had in mind a war situation when he gave that command. I think he was talking about, like I said, quotidian situations. So I don't think we should interpret the text as something that must apply in every situation and try and strain to find a way in which shooting someone could be a loving act. However, you can see it as a loving act in general, and people have talked about that because it's in the service of justice for the greater good. And in a sense, it is a communicative act. Oliver O'Donovan makes this point in probably The Ways of Judgment, that in a sense the punishment is a good given to the criminal because you're telling the truth about what they've done. And receiving the truth is a good thing. But I wouldn't say Jesus had that in mind when he said love your enemies, like yes, you can shoot them, because that's not the kind of situations he had in mind. He was talking about like day-to-day interactions with people in normal life, not a soldier or a police officer or a magistrate. So does that make sense? You can clarify if you need to. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Follow up that.
He's coming.
Yeah, so to follow up that, I mean, it seems like the classic statement, the principle of double effect, is a way of trying to do that, which is saying that the death of the enemy is never directly willed as such. That, what is willed is basically stopping them from the evil that they're about to commit or whatever, and and their death is, as it were, an unavoidable consequence of that need to stop them.
I think
that's more often used in a kind of, I'm trying to think, that's used in a sort of self-defense kind of situation. Is that applied in any kind of act of killing or warfare?
I think.
Yeah, Nigel Bigger uses that in defense of war.
Okay.
He uses that sort of that.
Right. I think at least you would say it's not the end. The final end of the action is not simply to kill somebody. There's another reason involved, and there's an element of necessity in the motivation.
So I mean, the regret that you have, there should be regret, even in killing, and that regret is the love that you have for that person as a bearer of the Imago Dei.
Right, like I haven't read it, but I hear Augustine said somewhere like you should be killing with tears in your eyes, essentially. And yeah, the regret is not that you did it, like in the sense that you wish you hadn't done it, but like wish you didn't have to do it, in that sense. So, yeah.
I kind of heard this in different places in different ways in your talk, but the struggle between both the individual expressions of pacifism and corporate expressions of pacifism. Could you talk a little bit about the use? We talked about the state and the use of pacifism, but where are some of the challenges and the nuances that come when thinking through an individual expression of pacifism versus a corporate expression of pacifism?
Are you talking about from a pacifist point of view, or?
Well, when we project pacifism upon organizations or upon the state or upon other parts of corporate expression, like when it's not just a question of do I need to kill someone, but how are we acting together to bring about an end? Or
Yeah. So there are varieties of pacifism, as we mentioned. So some people, I think at moments Yoder's like this, maybe most of the time. He doesn't think of pacifism as something that's supposed to be imposed upon everyone. It's a Christian command given to Christians by Jesus. So in that case, he also assumes basically that Christians will never be in the majority in any society. They'll never have power. And I think he would say if they do have power, then they've already given up their Christianity in a way, the Constantinian fall temptation. So from that point of view, the community will always be a minority, will never have power. So it essentially, from the point of our political theory, we would say they're not a public itself. So they're always private in that way. There are other kinds of pacifists that would say everyone should implement this. And of course, if everyone did implement pacifism, then there would be no more war. That would be great. The problem comes when people don't do that. I'm not a liberal pacifist of that type that would want to argue that everyone should do this. So I don't know how they would answer that question, although I'm sure they thought about it. But does that answer your question? I'm not sure. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Hey. So I'm trying to think this through, and it sort of has to do with the C.S. Lewis quote that you were remembering, because doesn't he talk about two, a Frenchman and a German in the First World War who kill each other and then find each other
They laugh about it.
laughing about it afterwards. And I've thought about this a lot, like, can somebody who is so arguably, not arguably, the Germans were the aggressors. It was a just war to defend against them. Can you fight in an unjust war as a Christian? And if you can, I guess I'm trying to tie this almost into what Walter's talk was about yesterday. Is there a way in which seeking an absolute pure just war means that we seek to make our nation into an eschatological good in a way that actually ends up being damaging? So can we have ambiguity and non-eschatological good self-understanding as a nation and still have a just war and still be able to, can there be complexity and Christians on both sides fighting? is my question.
Well, that's a really good question. I'd say yes. And so can a Christian fight in an unjust war? And I assume by that you are asking, can a Christian fight on the unjust side?
Yes.
For a bad cause?
Yeah.
And that's the question of like, can a Christian sin? So I would say yes, they could. I mean, there are some sins that are so bad that we might wonder whether someone can legitimately be saved and do that. Like Paul talks about the man sleeping with his father's wife. I think Paul takes that as so obviously wrong that it seems like it's unlikely that there's the Spirit working inside that person. I think in war it's a lot more complicated because there's an element of trust for your superior involved. So maybe if you're the superior, then you might not be able to deliberately wage an unjust war as a Christian. But even then, people can do all kinds of weird things when they're sinning because it's not rational to sin. So yes, short answer, I think it's possible. Can we live with the fact that we may never have a purely just war, even from our side? I think so. I think we have to live as a community. We have to defend what needs to be defended. It doesn't justify doing evil. If we do commit injustice in war, then that's something we should repent of and seek to make amends for. But I don't think that means because we know eventually someone's going to sin in a battle, we should disband the army just so we don't accidentally commit a sin. Because then you're letting go of some other greater goods for the sake of perfection. So that perfect has become the enemy of the good in that case. Does that make sense?
It does, and I guess maybe the refinement of that I would want to say is, it's not that I'm looking for an excuse to have an unjust war. It's that I'm looking for a way to say this is a just war, and yet that does not mean that we are the kingdom of God on earth as an American empire or something like that.
Right. Well, yeah, certainly, like, performing a just act doesn't render you an infallible, sacralized magistrate, like Brad is talking about. It just means in that case you did the right thing. So, like, it would be illicit and irrational to infer from, we're on the just side here, therefore we are the complete instrument of God's will at all times in everything we do. Like, that would be a huge, massive leap. And I think contrary to the Bible to say that. Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying?
It seems like I feel like that might, as a Christian in the just war tradition, I feel like that might be a thing that I really want to try to do a lot, is to say it's possible to be in the right and yet not to be the ultimate instrument of God on earth.
Right. Oh boy.
Andrew. As you might imagine, I would have lots of things to say, but I will restrain myself and say a few things.
Sure.
First one, I've read your book quickly, as I told you,
Yeah.
and so I'm responding to your book as well as your presentation.
Sure.
How do I name this? I would have at least found the book much more engaging, and your presentation more engaging, if you had developed the logic of someone's argument like Richard Hayes or John Howard Yoder, rather than giving a couple of usable quotes and then going on to something else. Because you never give the reader, or no, I don't think you gave us this today, a sense of the whole of Richard Hayes' argument, for instance, and how he's trying to take the sense of the New Testament. And I also think it's not helpful to refer to somebody like him as a neo-Anabaptist. That may be a dismissive term, but he's a United Methodist. He believes what he believes because he reads the New Testament. He sees it saying that. So he's not that because he's a Mennonite, for instance.
Yeah.
He's a United Methodist. He reads the New Testament. It's also important to say that a whole host of scholarship today would reflect what Richard Hayes says, or something similar to it. N.T. Wright, arguably the most influential New Testament scholar in the world today, believes that Jesus taught nonviolence. He believes that Paul taught nonviolence. He himself is not a pacifist for his own particular reasons, but he does believe that the New Testament teaches nonviolence. So there are, and again, the scholarship, it seems to be pretty much in that vein by and large. I found your book pretty much devoid of engaging any serious New Testament scholarship. I was really quite surprised by that. You use one book on Sermon on the Mount. You probably quote from Craig Keener in his book on marriage or divorce and remarriage more than you talk about anybody. And then, for context, talking about natural law, I know of no serious New Testament scholar who thinks that natural law is a context within which Jesus is speaking. He's not thinking of natural law. His audience is not thinking of natural law. He's thinking of Judaism and what it means to be Jewish and what it means then to be a follower of Jesus. And so it's kind of odd to talk about natural law. It's rather anachronistic. We need to first understand what Jesus is saying and the context. And in that regard as well, zealotism, which gave rise to the Jewish War in 66, was a real live option. So this was an option for the people who were listening to Jesus. So this is not just about interpersonal family relationships. They're under the rule of the Roman Empire, and they hate it because they think it often causes them to commit idolatry. So they want the shackles of the Roman Empire to be thrown off of them. So there were lots of Jews who wanted to engage in violent behavior. So zealotry is an option. Just war theory is not an option. Jesus is not talking about or thinking about. Nobody's listening. That's listening to him probably is thinking about the just war theory. And then finally, the continuity and discontinuity between the Old Testament and New Testament, and the Old Testament and Jesus or Paul. That's something that I care a lot about, and I'm out of sync with a lot of my fellow Mennonites. I think the continuity between the Testaments is huge. And I think Jesus named some of that, as you were saying at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. What you did not ever quote was Jesus' strong statement, "You have heard, but I say unto you." And when he says that, a couple of times when he says that, he's specifically setting aside words that are drawn from legislation related to capital punishment in the one case, and hating your enemies on the other hand. So he has some particular things in mind, and he wants them to understand that this is the way you are to live, despite however you read the Old Testament. So there's continuity and there's discontinuity, and in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, he's highlighting discontinuity in a very specific way, and also the way he deals with the woman who's caught in adultery. Capital punishment was what was to be done with the woman caught in adultery, and he stops that. So there are some very specifics there. I could say more about him and Paul, but Richard Hayes and others have done the work for me.
Where should I begin? So Richard Hayes, I'll start with the easy one. Neo-Anabaptist. Yeah, I wasn't calling him a Mennonite, and I don't regard that term as a pejorative label. I meant it as a technical sense because of his reading of the New Testament on the issue of violence. Actually, I don't know if he is a Credo Baptist or not. So he may not be a technical Neo-Anabaptist. But I meant it in the sense that he's influenced by, say, Yoder's reading of Jesus on nonviolence. That's all I meant. It wasn't supposed to be a slant. And, yeah, I didn't present the full scope of their arguments for their positions. That's basically because it started as a series of blog posts that I wrote after kind of stewing on all of these books for years, and I just wanted to write my case for what Jesus said. So yeah, if I was going to write something more academic, then I would want to for sure give like a full account, at least a full summary of what they were saying. I don't think I misinterpreted them or misrepresented them though, in what I did say. In terms of using New Testament scholarship, I read more than I cited. Again, this came from a bunch of blog posts, so you can criticize it for not being academically rigorous, but it never was intended to be that, except in the sense that it's accurate, I think, and it depends on correct exegesis, but it's not. I wouldn't send this to a New Testament journal's study article. Trying to recall everything you mentioned. Oh, okay. The antitheses. Yeah, I don't actually read him as ever pitting the Old Testament against what he's saying. I know in some cases he does quote Old Testament laws, but then when you see the kind of behavior he's talking about, that's not what the law is talking about. Or in another case, he says don't swear an oath, but we know from the rest of the New Testament that Christians did sometimes swear oaths. Paul does essentially do that in the letters he writes. So in some cases, he seems to be opposing the Old Testament, but then we see Christians didn't interpret him in a rigorous or wooden way when he does that. And I think in the case of do not resist an evil person, the cases he gives are not of people administering legal punishments. They're all private context cases. So I don't see him there as opposing what the law was talking about, which is when you're administering a civil punishment, be proportionate to the crime. So I think when you look at all the antitheses in what he says and how they're interpreted in the rest of the New Testament, in none of the cases is he actually contradicting what the Old Testament said in its original context. I didn't give a full account of that because that would require going into other issues like divorce and oath-taking and all that other stuff. I just wanted to give what I thought was interpretation of that. The zealot option was certainly real. But I don't think that means that that necessarily is what he's talking about in these cases. I think, especially when the content of what he does enjoin upon us is essentially found in the Old Testament, I think it would take more than simply repeating the Old Testament to say that he was rejecting all of violence as an expression of the zealot option. What else?
Natural law.
Natural law, yeah. So here, I would disagree with you. I think that when Jesus talks about marriage and divorce in Matthew 19, he appeals to male and female. The creation of the human race in this form is essentially the basis for rejecting frivolous divorce. So I think he had an understanding of the creation order. Doubtful he would use the term natural law from the Stoics or whatever, but the idea, I think, was found in the Old Testament and simply in reality where he could see it himself. Certainly, the idea of natural law is present in the New Testament. Paul cites the natural use of man and woman, so it's not anachronistic to think that a first century Jew could know the concept of natural law in that case. So I think because it's real, I think natural law is real, and because it was known then, because it was implicitly present in Jewish sources, there's every reason to think he would assume people knew natural law, even if they didn't know the term natural law. And so it is part of the background of what he's saying. Did I cover everything?
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, though. I appreciate the pushback.
Yeah.
We can give a round of applause again.